Welcome back to Ether Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin and a very special guest today. We are excited to have him introduce ourselves. We're joined by George McMillan, a geopolitical consultant, analyst, somebody that really knows about the deep grand strategy, geopolitics, energy politics that undergird what we consider the ongoing Third World War. We're really excited to have him on. I'm going to give him a chance to introduce himself here in a second. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. Excited to be here with our very special guest today. It's going to be a great talk.
I agree. This is a very World War Now episode, so strap right in. This is going to be some really good, deep geopolitical analysis. But with all that being said, George, welcome to the show. Feel free to tell our audience anything you would like them to know about yourself, your background, your experience in analyzing these momentous events that we are living through.
Educationally, I'm a political science major. I have master's degree in political theory, international relations, and an MPA. I've been a private military contractor and a security consultant for the better part of the last 20 years. I've been working in Iraq and Afghanistan with different companies under different capacities, either doing security or different operations, mostly operations center work.
Well, I think you have more than enough experience to discuss all the theaters of conflict that we get into on this show, which is very rare. We don't always get people. Some people, they know a lot about Russia. They know a lot about what's going on over in Taiwan. They know a lot about what's going on in the Middle East, Syria, and the Levant. But you're somebody that I think is a bit of a jack of all trades regarding all of the things we're living through right now. So I guess we should just dive right in. Of course, everybody's kind of reeling from Trump's bizarre comments about Gaza at his meeting with Netanyahu. Where people are posting pictures of Trump Tower on the Gaza Strip. What's going to happen? Everybody is afraid of potential U.S. troops on the ground, of potential, we remember Trump said that Saudi Arabia is no longer asking for a Palestinian state. That, of course, is not true. The Saudis have not balked on their commitment to Palestinian statehood if they are to recognize Israel and normalize relations. And of course, Trump's comments about Gaza raise a lot of questions about, the international energy battle that's going on and, the different corridors of pipelines that are kind of undergirding what's really going on at the political level in this ongoing Third World War. Specifically regarding Gaza, of course, we know about the IMEC corridor that is going to go from India up through the Persian Gulf, through the Emirates, eventually through Saudi Arabia, and then into Israel and Gaza, even connecting with the Tamar, gas and oil fields off the coast of Gaza. So, George, I'm wondering, what is going on with Trump's comments? We see the Gaza ceasefire was entered into in bad faith by the Israelis. What do you think is the future there, and how will it affect the rest of the Levant, which we know regarding Syria, Yemen, Lebanon is also very much embroiled in a very hot regional conflict?
Oh, I mean, yeah, everybody is talking about Trump's press conference with Bibi Netanyahu. And as far as the United States taking over Gaza and rebuilding Gaza and either temporarily or permanently moving the inhabitants over to either Jordan or Egypt, that totally caught everybody by surprise, including Bibi Netanyahu. What he was thinking about and what the feasibility of that is, I don't know. Everybody is talking about how feasible that whole issue is. People don't think it was thought through. It looks like Trump just felt like he had to say something, so he had to come up with some kind of solution, some kind of light at the end of the tunnel. So it looks like he just said he was going to rebuild it and, move the Palestinians elsewhere. Of course, there's been, over the Gaza situation, there's been protests in Amman, Jordan, and other places in the area. So it did not go over very well in the Sunni Arab world. So we have to see where he's going to go with that. If that's going to go anywhere anyway, I think it was just something Trump said just to change the subject and put some kind of positive light on his foreign policy. I like his Western policy very much. He realizes that the United States has to consolidate its resources with North and South America. If trade relationships between North America and Europe or North America and Asia are going to break down with the tensions between the United States, Russia, China, and Iran, then yes, he's going to have to get all the resources from North and South America combined and use each other's markets so you can get markets of scale. And just to let people understand what geostrategic modeling is about, geostrategic modeling is basically about three things. The first of it is integrated political and economic development strategies, which is about, well, increasing, it's very Adam Smith and David Ricardo. It's about increasing division of labor. And the Ricardo aspect is about increasing, absolute and comparative advantages by efficiently moving around resources. So then you get into, what is economics? Economics is ultimately boils down to taking resources out of the ground, whether it be mineral, petroleum, or agriculture, turning it into a consumer product, which has to go through multiple industrial processing stages, and then distributing it to the consumers and then repeating the cycle. That comes up with Rostow's 5 stages of growth. All right. And then a whole bunch of economic growth theories that have been developed since the 1950s to better understand how that cycle works. Geostrategic theory is the opposite of political economic development theory. So political economic development theory is how, in a perfect world, how would you move these resources around from wherever they're made to whatever factories they need to go to put them into whatever combination that they need to be put into, to make different metals or alloys or just different products or clothes, whatever. And how is that done if you're just looking at a map as if everybody got along just great, there were no trade tariff barriers? What would be the most efficient way to do it? And then geostrategic theory is the opposite. How do you facilitate that for your allies? And how do you sabotage each one of those stages for your rivals? Then when you figured out how you want to sabotage each one of those steps for your rivals, then comes the third element of targeting packages. It could be destroying somebody's financial system, but in the history of geopolitical thought, of mercantilism, it's always, especially since Alfred Thayer Mahan did the quintessential expose of that in his effect of sea power, he focuses on the old sailing ship days of blocking in each other's ports, with the critical aspect of being, production is what you produce in a given economy or different given political economy, but wealth is created by trading your excess of what you produce for money or trading for goods that you need. So ultimately, since you have to clear current account balances, ultimately you're using money for, as a form, so you don't get bogged down by barter. You might need stuff from a whole bunch of different countries to improve your own political economy in some way. So in that case, you're using different countries are necessarily using export-led growth strategies to facilitate some type of import substitution industrialization investment strategy. So ELG, ISI strategies. So if in a perfect world, economic theory is about facilitating your export-led growth, import substitution investments, and then geostrategic policies about, or strategies is about how to sabotage rivals. So then the third part is your military targeting packages. In the days of Alfred Thayer Mahan, your military targeting packages was seaports. But then that quickly shifted. Once the railroad was produced, it shifted the advantage away from the sea power sailing ship dominance to a land power logistical supply route dominance through the application of trains to move goods between land powers. Well, then that has to shift the naval strategy of not just taking over the seaports, but it increases the emphasis on taking over riverine ports, key rivers, and taking over terrestrial choke points as well. Terrestrial choke points are typically mountain ranges in between rivers or mountain ranges in between seas. So Geostrategic theory, as far as that goes, is about taking over maritime choke points, riverine choke points, and terrestrial land bridge choke points, which becomes, if you understand that, then the 20 years of global war on terror starts to make more sense. Terrorism is used to take over the Middle East because then you're taking over the land bridges between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf, between the Persian Gulf and the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, and taking over the choke points of, well, Strait of Hormuz, Strait of Bab el-Mandab, in the Red Sea, the Suez Canal. Okay, a canal is necessarily a man-made riverine choke point, and then also controlling the Dardanelles Strait and the Bosphorus Straits, and then when you get back to eastern Black Sea, the Crimea and the Kerch Strait. So the whole movement, or let me put it this way, the US and UK sea power countries had control over the maritime choke points during the Cold War. As the Cold War ended and they started to move NATO and the EU and NATO east, the purpose of that is to take over the riverine and the terrestrial land bridge choke points. So once you understand that, then everything that the US does make sense. In this case, I'm not even saying the presidents do it. It's the discrete entities inside the United States that are doing this. I don't even think the presidents are even aware to a large extent. I think it, from what I can tell, from what I can observe, it seems to happen more behind the scenes, because the purpose of moving the NATO east is so if you move a trading bloc east, those inside the trading bloc enjoy tariff and non-trade tariff barrier advantages. Those people outside the trading bloc are now frozen out. So once you move NATO east all the way to the Russian border, well, it's going to be the Baltic states, Poland and Ukraine, and Georgia. Then you're putting a cordon sanitaire on Russian trade, blocking it from going west. So you're putting everybody in the whole entire European peninsula inside the trading bloc, and you're keeping Russia, you're barring them from the entire European peninsula. So it's a different form of strategies of containment, because if you're doing it with a military branch, then the grand strategist there's 4 levels of warfare. The grand strategic level on top, that's mainly the analysts that work for big finance and big oil. And then below that is what they call the institutional levels of warfare, which on the military side is going to be the strategic level of warfare, the operational level of warfare, and the tactical level of warfare. So the Army is just dealing with the regional, strategic, and operational and tactical levels of warfare, but the grand strategic level of warfare really exists outside of government, but is always interfaced with the key people in the intelligence community and the Pentagon. Ever since the Brown brothers, Harriman and Sullivan Cromwell, between World War I and World War II. Or some people would, actually it goes back even before World War I, but I'll just peg it from there for the sake of this conversation. So the whole pretext of moving NATO east was to eventually stop all Russian trade. And then what it really comes down to is cutting off all Russian natural gas going from Russia to the east, because if the more Russia integrates with Germany, with the German industrial power center, then the more infrastructurally integrated Germany is with Russia, then the more economically integrated they are, the more diplomatically integrated Germany and Russia becomes, then the more militarily Russia comes. So I'm using the dime analysis DIME is the acronym. It stands for diplomacy, infrastructural or informational integration, military and economic. So it's in a DIME mnemonic, but the way it actually flows causally is infrastructural integration leads to economic, diplomatic, and military integration. So knowing that those things flow together is what the West did not want Europe to integrate with Russia, because the whole U.S. foreign policy is based on Kennan's 5 power center doctrine. That's after World War II, Ambassador George Kennan in Moscow sent a long telegram, his famous long telegram that if you're not familiar with it, just Google that and read the Wikipedia version of it. That's fine. He did a follow-up in his 1950 Foreign Affairs article that was titled X. It was anonymous. He didn't want to get in trouble right away for being in the State Department and wanting to overstep his bounds. So he wrote an X article, but it became the basis of America's strategy of containment. That strategy of containment, and then it became the basis of the Marshall Plan. It's based on having North America in power center strategy, power center number 1, directly connected to the European and industrial power center number 2, and then Japan and the first island chain as being in power center number 3. And you're supposed to isolate Russia in power center number 4. And then at that time, Mao Zedong had defeated Chiang Kai-shek in China and others. And so then China became power center number 5. So that, they weren't initially an industrial power. They were a backwards country, but they had 1 billion people living there. So they were actually labeled as an industrial power center number 5. So the whole strategy of containment is based on surrounding and isolating the Soviet Union to stop the spread of communism, like the domino theory. And then 2, it was to stop and contain the spread of communism in China after Mao Zedong took over. And then the third aspect of that is to interfere between Russia and China as much as you can by, let me back up just a second and say that Kennan's 5 power center doctrine is based on Mackinder and Speakman's heartland versus rimland strategy. So if Mackinder started shifting towards the potential land power advantage of overland logistical supply routes going from the heartland, back then it would have been it was Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, because Mackinder originally wrote at Oxford at the turn of the century. So then after the Bolshevik Revolution, then it became the Soviet Union. So it was how to contain the Russian heartland in general, then it became the Soviet Union dominated heartland of Russia. So what they didn't want was the heartland that's Russia, that has the most natural resources aligning with any coastal industrial power center, because then they would become infrastructurally integrated and economically integrated, then diplomatically and military integrated. Then that would leave the United States isolated in North America. So that was why, to keep the United States from getting isolated away from all of Eurasia, the United States quickly adopted the rimland strategy, where keeping Europe as the allies, keeping the Middle East where the oil is as allies, and keeping the first island chain in the Pacific to block in Russia and, Soviet Union, now Russia and China contained, and then moving into Southeast Asia. The OSS moved into Southeast Asia in 1945 to support the Syria against, to kick out the Japanese, but also prevent communism coming into Thailand and Laos. Thailand and Laos they speak the same language. It was one country before the French showed up and divided Thailand and Laos along the Mekong River.
Yeah.
So all of this was an immediate containment strategy that the United States did following Speakman's strategy. So when Kennan wrote in 47 and 50, he's really operationalizing Speakman's rimland strategy. He gave it a lot more definition to it, and it became a lot more of a coherent strategy. Now, a lot of us thought that after the Cold War ended, you would see, Russia being brought into a Northern Hemisphere alliance, and people would pursue the Kantian peace triangle of of economic interdependency, because that usually decreases war, and based upon democratic reforms across Eastern Europe and in Russia, and then using international organizations to facilitate that. Those are the three prongs of the Kantian peace triangle. Well, if you were going to pursue that strategy, and there's different ways of doing it, then the EU would have been extended to Russia to create a much more of an economic interdependency. But that's not what they did, and the reasons for that is clearly listed in the Wolfowitz doctrine of the United States being the only near-peer power and still wanting to break apart Russia into a whole bunch of separate oblasts and also get the oil. So the Kantian peace triangle was totally not considered under the Wolfowitz and Rand doctrine to not let them pursue an export-led growth strategy so they could have an import substitution investment strategy to rebuild their economy. And they state this several places. They didn't want Russia to have economic growth because then they could have military growth. You remember Clausewitz and Bismarck, the whole blood and steel strategy of your economy supports your military,
Yep.
and your diplomatic power is only as strong as your economic and military power. So when they did the Chatelain 500-day plan, the shock therapy plan to convert Russia from a non-market economy to a market economy, the West intentionally put the oligarchs in power in Eastern Europe and in Russia so they would invest their money into Wall Street so that you would have it's based on maximizing capital flight out of Russia and Eastern Europe into the banks of London and Wall Street, so Russia never would develop. So once Eastern Europe figured that out, well, then the pro-Russian hardliners got rid of Yeltsin and they put Putin in power, and they wanted him to have more of a domestic-friendly policy. Now, Jeffrey Sachs talks about the breaking up of the oligarchs was done in Poland. And I had great conversations back in end of 2017 and beginning of 2018 with people in Poland about this. And I actually got off the train station in Warsaw and was talking to the bartenders over at the Hard Rock Cafe, and it turned out they're political science majors. So we talked for, they were talking for like 4 or 5 hours. It was a couple of days before Christmas, and nobody was in the place. So I just sat back, had my late breakfast and just sat and just listened to them talk for 4 or 5 hours.
Wow.
Because it was just a complete, you couldn't have gotten, I realize they're bartenders, but they also had master's degrees in political science. And they speak English great. So I had this big information download that I thought was great. So the whole point, let me back off of here a second. Richard Audie is a professor from, I forget which UK university, but he had written, the politics of minerals in North Africa or something like that. I forget exactly what the book's out of print, but it's the resource curse theory. Most people know it by that than the real name of the book. And in that book, he talks about how the big multinational corporations come in, they extract the minerals from the ground, and they just pay off whatever local dictator there is. And because of that, and then they export the capital to the West, the profits go back to London or Wall Street, and then these countries don't politically or economically develop. Okay, so if you're not politically or economically developing, then you're not geopolitically developing from a third world country to a second world or a first world country.
Mm-hmm.
So I use that as a single independent variable setup because it's political and economic development equals geopolitical development towards a first world country as your outcome measure. That's upgraded by Lipset's 1959 article, Some Social Requisites for Democracy. I don't want to get too much into those models, but it's another talk for another day. But instead of, Richard Audi wrote his book about what has occurred and what we need to stop. Okay, like Orwell's 1984, the powers that be end up using that as an owner's manual.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I just want the audience to stop and let that sink in a little bit.
No, absolutely.
It's not just Orwell's book that they use as an owner's manual. There's a couple other owner's manuals out there, and Richard Audie's book is one of them.
And sort of with that consideration in mind, so the fact that the powers that be already have these sort of blueprints in place, I had a specific question on the recent fall of Syria and Russia's ongoing withdrawal, because that, I think, has taken many people by surprise, at least those who haven't been really paying attention. And exactly what were Russia's considerations? Does Russia have a blueprint? Did it have this plan of withdrawing from Syria and the potential of maybe President Assad's regime falling? Well, it has been 9 years since Russia's first intervention to assist President Assad in September of 2015. And so did Russia have any economic considerations in perhaps withdrawing out of Syria, and perhaps maybe it had some pre-arrangements with the neighboring countries? Like there is some, of course, talks about Russia communicating with Turkey and how kind of arranging the entire withdrawal process in the beginning. And so just your thoughts on that, if possible, George.
Okay, yeah, there's a whole bunch of different ways to go with this. I want to go back and play off what I said before about the global war on terror being a pretext for taking over the petroleum fields and the land bridge pipeline routes into Europe, because they don't want, it turns out that America's biggest fear is stopping Russian natural gas from integrating into Europe. So if they're going to take over, if they're going to prevent Russian natural gas from going to, well, it's Germany that you're principally concerned with. So if you're going to stop Russian natural gas from going to Germany, then they need to replace it with an additional energy source. And this is when you start to come to realize the extent that this whole plan of moving NATO east and then the global war on terror was planned decades in advance. Because again, how long has Great Britain been trying to block in all of Russia's seaports? I mean, that goes back hundreds of years.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Mahan may have been the first person to articulate that, or one of the early people to articulate that in terms of, well, his production versus wealth, paradigm. His model is based on that. So that's based on Adam Smith, because Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations in 1776. Yeah. So, and then shortly after that, David Ricardo wrote, his thesis on on political economy, on absolute and comparative advantage principles. So he wrote about that. So then GWAT, the way I usually discuss GWAT's the global war on terror. The way I usually discuss that, and this has bearing with Syria, because you start to see what, the underlying reasons of why this is occurring. Forget about the political rhetoric. That's what's discussed in the legacy media. And when you see the Trump administration talk about how they're going to deal with Putin from his strength, and Russia invaded for no reason, and Ukraine is winning the war, that's how you start to understand the rhetoric that's put out by the mainstream media comes from the grand strategists in BlackRock that own the mainstream media. So even the Trump administration has bought into this rhetoric. what we're driving at here is the underlying sea power versus land power rationale.
Mhm.
When you understand the sea power versus land power rationale, in trying to elevate your own economic growth and then sabotage the economic growth of rivals, then you're understanding the underlying reasoning that's the real reason for all these activities. So the way I discuss that is in terms of General Wesley Clark's 7 countries in 5 years speeches that he was giving during his 2007 campaign speeches and subsequent speeches, where he talks about there's a foreign policy coup.
Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this amazing Ether Hour episode. This is a really deep and long one, of course, with our good friend George McMillan, analyst, geostrategic consultant, former special forces, somebody that knows more than almost anybody about the grand chessboard of World War III that is unfolding, its basis in the energy wars, as well as its religious and, theological even components. He knows a lot about that, especially across the different metaphysical traditions that are clashing across the world. So be sure to get behind the paywall here, the full discussion, his breakdown on, he even gives predictions about what's going to happen in Russia, what's going to happen in China, Taiwan, what's going to happen in the Middle East. It's really a fantastic, really broad bird's eye view analysis from the grand strategy perspective. So thank you so much for listening, and we will see you on the other side. Thank you and God bless.